Hello, welcome to In Monty's Footsteps. I am sitting on a memorial bench. It says, behind this bench stood the magnificent neo-Gothic red brick building of St Paul's School. Boys were evacuated in World War II and it became the HQ for 21st Army Group, commanded by former pupil General Montgomery, affectionately known as Monty. I am Henry Montgomery and Monty was my grandfather. Over the past 2 months, I've travelled 4,000 miles across Britain and Normandy following my grandfather's journey of April and May 1944, as he visited troops, factories and building morale in the country as a whole. I've interviewed veterans, relatives of those who served and those who fell, and historians to discover the untold stories from ordinary men and women who contributed back home to the enormous effort that went into and ultimately contributed to the success of D-Day and the Normandy campaign. This is my journey in Monty's footsteps. I think the first time I became aware that grandfather was famous was when I was about 5, and actually about the same age as I was in this picture, which is my sister and I with grandfather in his garden. To me, grandfather was grandfather, and that's what I called him. I remember him as kind, generous, extremely friendly, good sense of humour, gave my sister and I lots of freedom to play in his garden and in his caravans. In December, I went to the Imperial War Museum and dug out my grandfather's diaries. In reading the diaries, I discovered this extraordinary journey that my grandfather travelled on in April and May 1944, when he travelled the length and breadth of Britain visiting troops and visiting factories. And I was struck by 2 things. Firstly, the extent of his travels and the amount of meetings that he had every day. And secondly, how much football played in his journey. He went to at least 2 football matches. But the last entry is probably the most striking, because it says on the 6th of June, simply invaded Normandy, left Portsmouth 10:30 p.m. And on that page, there is no other entry. He was obviously quite busy with other things at the time. I began my journey in St Paul's Gardens, Hammersmith, on the former grounds of St Paul's School, where 82 years earlier Monty held D-Day planning meetings known as Operation Thunderclap. This is an entry from the 7th of April. He says, I held a 2-day exercise which was attended by all general officers of the field armies. My object was to put all senior officers and their staffs completely into the whole overlord picture, as affecting the general plan, the naval problem, and the air action. This was done on the first day, 7th of April. On the 8th of April, that's today, I held an exercise where we examined certain situations that might arise in the Overlord operation, either during the approach by sea or in the land battle itself. Absolutely fascinating to be here on the same day as grandfather was here 82 years ago. I wanted to get some context on the Second World War and the build-up to D-Day with historian Tim Bouverie. I read that Eisenhower wrote a letter almost on the eve of D-Day saying that if it all went wrong, he took full responsibility. Because it was a very complicated, the numbers behind D-Day and what was actually happening in terms of the planning and the training and just the logistics of actually having an invasion force of that scale was enormous.
It was a huge operation. An operation like this had never been considered before. And when one thinks of how difficult it was and how much preparation had to go into it, one realizes actually how far away the Germans probably were from really being able to launch an invasion of Britain in 1940. Regardless of their abilities as generals, as tacticians and soldiers, I think there is not a single person who could have led a truly allied coalition as well as Dwight Eisenhower. He was a master politician. He was able to deal with some very strong characters who had a strong conceit of themselves, which would include on his side people like Patton, but also people like your grandfather. There was no gainsaying that D-Day was going to be a success. Eisenhower probably thought it would be, but if it wasn't, he was going to take full responsibility, which as Supreme Commander was entirely right. Churchill felt that 60,000 men could have been killed on the first morning. As they come ashore, they're going to be sitting ducks for the German machine guns.
And that was out
mortars.
of, I think there was 150 that landed in France, but quite a few of those were parachutes.
Parachutes, yes.
So there was about 135,000 that landed on the beaches on D-Day.
And it was certainly a good 4 times what the actual casualty figures were. To give you an idea of the political risk of this, just before the launch of Operation Torch, the amphibious invasion of North Africa, which had occurred in November of 1942, he had said privately, if this fails, I will have to resign.
Yes.
I cannot go in front of the House of Commons and tell them that we've had another evacuation, another Dunkirk, another failed operation, another evacuation from the beaches could have been terminal to his political career.
What do you think, when you stand back and all the research you did, would have been the consequences of it going wrong?
I think we could probably say with a fair degree of certainty that had D-Day failed, the war would have gone on for at least another 1.5 to 2 years.
Yeah.
It would have led to serious soul-searching among the Western allies. It would have disheartened the Soviets, possibly even to the extent of them seeking a separate peace with the Germans. There would have been certainly calls for Churchill to resign. There had been earlier. There would have certainly been calls, and maybe successful calls, for Churchill to cede control of the military aspects of the war to a Supreme Defence Minister, to surrender the Defence Ministry, which he had assumed when he became Prime Minister in 1940. It's unthinkable, and that is why the British in particular were so determined that this should not be launched until they could ensure overwhelming superiority over the enemy.
When I read my grandfather's diaries, I was surprised to read that not only had he been to a football match, but that actually football was even happening during the Second World War. To find out more, I went to the Scottish National Football Stadium, Hampden Park.
Football was the lifeblood of, I think, of the UK for a large percentage of the population. So it was very important for morale to try and continue to have, big events like football taking place. It was a desperate time, as you know, to be probably living through that time. So it was important to try and have these occasions where we say in football, to escape for 90 minutes, to forget what's happening round about you, and to just focus on watching these great football players, playing in these fantastic arenas. Football could bring in much needed revenue as well for the war effort. So there's a lot of charities, wartime charities, that would benefit, including the armed forces themselves.
Grandfather came to this football match on the 22nd of April 1944. Do you know much about that and what he was doing here?
General Montgomery was one of the biggest figures in the UK for obvious reasons at that particular time, and his presence was very important, I would imagine, for 2 reasons. Morale, first of all, with such a huge group of people in this stadium, 133,000. It was very important for them to see their general walking through the door and walking onto the pitch to greet the players. That was important. That meant something to them. There were a lot of charitable causes that were important to him and to the war effort, and obviously he needed to be seen to be promoting that as well. And so it was important for him to be at these big public events, ensuring that was part of the kind of celebrations going out on the pitch.
But when he was here, you think he would have walked out of the tunnel like the teams did at half time to meet, presumably, because there are pictures of him meeting people, I think, at half time, which I think were the teams, but also some of the dignitaries who would have been here at the time.
He's a VIP.
Yeah.
He is the VIP. He's such an important person within UK history. He is probably the most prominent member of our armed forces. At that time, you have to think about that, and the war is raging at that time, albeit it's going towards the end. It's still a very important time in the war. So he is a very, very important person, and I can almost imagine how it probably would have been carried out. I do remember the old Queen's Park main stand, a wonderful old stand going back to before this modern stand was created. And as a VIP coming in, he had been well received, and there were lovely kind of rooms to sit in while you were waiting for the game to kick off. and before he was asked to come out to meet the players or to go out to acknowledge the crowd. And so I can imagine him with a cup of tea, and I can imagine him with sandwiches. All that would have been put on for him because it was a big deal for him coming to Hampden Park.
This is the programme from the
From the
match
match, yeah.
between England and Scotland, 22nd April 1944.
Yeah, and the first thing I would say is it's very small. It's because of the war.
Yeah.
It's just the restrictions and the difficulties of creating even the programmes at the time.
Today's game is the 12th of the wartime internationals. England have won 7, Scotland 2, and 2 have been drawn. This was before this match.
Yeah.
So, I have to say that sadly for Scotland, England won this match. So-
I mean, look at the players on the see. Stanley Matthews, Ray Carter, Tommy Lawton. You came up to win, I think, looking at those players.
Shortly after leaving Hampden Park, I met up with Jean Matthews-Goff, who is Stanley Matthews' daughter.
He was very modest, very humble, but inside he wanted to be the best.
Yes.
He was quite aggressive in that. The way he played in the game, he would be very happy when he was fouled, because he was fouled a lot, but he quite luckily avoided much injury because he was quite agile at missing it. He never fouled, never sent off, nothing like that.
No.
But at home, out came the competition. He wouldn't be beaten at anything.
Oh, really? What
Even
games?
tiddlywinks.
Tiddlywinks?
Putting, tennis, cricket. He had to win.
I think in that respect,
Your father, your
my
grandfather
grandfather and your father,
had the same instinct.
they did. They didn't like losing.
No,
We share a similar sort of,
upbringing.
well, in a sense of growing up with somebody who's really, really famous.
Oh, I always used to say, it's just my pop.
Yeah.
You know, that's it. Truthfully, it was daunting, stifling, hard to live up to,
Yeah.
but it was also very inspiring. It was very lovely, I think it was. It meant I had to try and live up to this
Yes.
name, which made me a goody-goody.
Your experience actually was very different to mine because he was your father. You lived with him, whereas it was my grandfather who was famous, and I didn't spend that much time. You know, I wasn't living in his home. So,
But
somebody
you
who
had
was
to
a
live
super-
up to this Montgomery name.
I often tell the story of my first sort of real experience of grandfather being quite a famous person, and it was going to the Royal Tournament, and he was taking the salute at the Royal Tournament, and there was a red carpet rolled out, and there were all these people lining the red carpet, and they were trying to touch grandfather and patting me on the head. I think I was sort of traumatized by that. You know, it's the first time I
Yes.
felt, gosh, you know, who is this man
Yes.
who was my
It's a
grandfather?
bit scary.
It was very scary, and so I sort of probably tried to bury it for quite a long time, which was easier to do for me. During my journey, I have recorded conversations with over 100 people, some of which had been filmed, and I've also taken loads of my own photographs. My hope is that this documentary, as well as the podcast series In Monty's Footsteps, gives people an opportunity to hear first-hand stories of the war in a way that helps them connect the present to the past. I learnt about the role of women attached to the Royal Navy, known as Wrens.
I was right in the lower part where
Yeah.
I was a steward.
What did the steward do?
Look after the captain, I did. I had the
Or
captain.
did you?
order.
So you were their personal servant,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah.
Was that common? Did everybody have? Did
All the officers, well, an ordinary one stripe,
Yeah.
they would still have workers. They wouldn't
Okay.
do so much for them, but they'd have to clean the rooms and
Okay.
keep the rooms tidy,
So if
serve
you-
at table.
When you started, you might have been looking after 2 or 3 people, but as you became,
That's right.
as you rose up the ranks, as
Yeah.
it were, you were
But
looking
I
after
was
more
very
senior.
lucky. I got out of everything because
Yeah.
I was a captain steward.
But HMS Quebec was a training centre, wasn't it? And so it was a training centre preparing.
Yeah, we
troops
didn't know
for-
what they were for.
But you knew that they were, so it was basically training for amphibious landings, wasn't it?
Or
So-
something, because there was boats out in the loch,
And they were always.
and there was marines up the loch.
Right.
There was army at the village.
Yeah. So they were
And they-
constantly doing training
Yeah,
exercise.
but we didn't know what for.
So Ruth, I'm looking at photographs and memories of your time at HMS Quebec. Oh, look, an employment certificate. Leading Wren, Steward officer duties. Character during service.
Bad.
No. Very good, it says. General efficiency during service. Above average. Power of command. Good. Energy. Very good.
I'd got a lot of energy in them days.
Pretty impressive, actually. Oh, these are the menus, yes. I hope you got to eat some of this food because you actually cooked rather good food for the captain. So
We
that
used to have the leftovers.
31st of July 1944, you had lobster mornay, braised tongue, caramel creams, followed by coffee.
Yeah, that got.
And then within a week, you'd also had more lobster mayonnaise. So you had plenty of lobster.
Yeah,
Straight out
hours
of the
a
loch.
week. The chief cook was my friend.
There's some brilliant pictures here of you as a wren. So there's a picture here of you, Ruth. I can see in the picture here it's permed. How much did a perm cost you?
I don't think it cost much. Might have been not even £1.
But £1 was quite a lot. How much did you get paid?
14 shillings a week.
But you spent more than a week's wages on a perm.
Oh yeah, probably. You had to save. You had to save up for a perm. But we had nothing to spend our money on, really.
No, those are great pictures. I love the Poe hat. I think the Poe hat is great. D-Day, because all of the troops will have suddenly
Oh yeah,
disappeared.
that was the weekend when we woke up and everybody had gone.
Oh, they'd all gone. So suddenly everything was quiet. Yes.
Yeah.
Because they would have all been transported on the trains down to...
No one knew that they were going. I don't think them in their own who were going
Knew what was
They
happening.
woke them up and took them about 2:00 in the morning.
So suddenly you woke up the next morning.
All the officers had gone. They'd just left skeletons.
Yes. So that was the weekend.
Yeah.
Nobody was telling you anything.
No, we didn't know anything.
What did you think 2 days later when you heard the news?
We didn't have any news really,
Didn't you?
because we didn't have any radios or anything up there.
Oh, right.
No.
It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you this afternoon. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, it's nice to see Monty's grandson. He was very popular.
He was, yes. Why do you think Monty was so popular?
Well, he was good, I think.
He won battles?
But I think all the troops liked him.
I've absolutely loved interviewing people. I feel very comfortable talking to people and hearing their amazing stories. And it's actually been very easy because the people I've talked to have been extraordinarily forthcoming in the way they have opened up and talked very honestly about their experiences. I have realised in doing this how extraordinary the professionals are at this job, because particularly when I'm trying to say something off the cuff, I definitely mess up big time. I think I'm slightly taken aback by the amount of interest, actually. When I started the journey, I thought this is quite interesting, but everybody seems to think that it is a wonderful thing to be doing. I've obviously, over the years, picked up a reasonable amount of knowledge about what happened on D-Day and the Normandy campaign, but I really didn't have any idea of the amazing effort that was made by ordinary people up and down the country. And in a sense, that's what I wanted to capture, but I wasn't aware of how extensive that was. And I certainly wasn't aware of the pain and suffering and trauma that many families suffered during the war and actually continue to suffer after the war. So it's been a deeply humbling experience to listen to their stories, which they've told with honesty and humility.
I started researching, looking for kind of current things happening where women were being encouraged into forestry, but there wasn't anything happening at the time. And luck happened when I phoned up a lady from Human Resources in Scotland, from the forest.
In the forestry commission.
Yeah, and she said, women in forestry is nothing new, Joe. They've been doing it in their thousands since World War I and World War II. They would be felling trees with an axe and saw, and their nickname was the Lumberjills. And that's where it all started.
And you'd never heard of the Lumberjills
No,
before?
no.
Oh, good. So I'm glad it's not just me.
No, it's not just, it's many, many people.
Conway Morfa was the site that parts of the Mulberry Harbour, parts of the artificial harbour that were used on D-Day and the Battle of Normandy were made.
The crucial thing that was secrecy, wasn't it? And yet here they were building these enormous constructions.
Absolutely, and you know, it was described to local people as a shipyard rather than anything else. And I guess because of its location next to the water's edge, they sort of got away with that as a description. But you had that wartime mantra, didn't you, a sort of careless talk costs lives and loose lips sink ships. So people didn't sort of ask that many questions. This was a huge industrial site. The prototypes were leviathans of concrete and steel, and men were working 24 hours round the clock. There were about 1,000 employed just building these prototypes.
In the weeks leading up to D-Day, hundreds of thousands of servicemen converged on the south coast to prepare for the invasion. I visited Fort Southwark near Portsmouth, which was home to the Combined Operations Underground Headquarters. We are here at Fort Southwark, which is not normally open to the public, and we're sitting in this observation tower. What would the view have been on the 4th of June?
4th of June. Well, you wouldn't see quite so much in here, in the anchorage on the inside of Portsmouth. So you've got Portsmouth, and then you've got Gosport on the other side, which is the great submarine base. But there, of course, is the Isle of Wight.
Yes.
And this is the Solent, and that is the great anchorage. I mean, that would have just been black with ships. If you were here in, let's say, the middle of July, it's a constant shuttle of supplying troops, provisions, medical care, wounded back, more shells, more ammunition, more tanks.
Presumably the numbers of people who were back home organising that logistical operation was a huge number of people.
I mean, the whole of southern England is just turned into a military base, basically.
Tell us about the weather, because the weather was a big issue, obviously.
Well, the weather's a big issue, so it's absolutely glorious second half of May. I mean, really, really hot. But then suddenly, as May gives way to June, the weather starts to turn, and it's clear that this low pressure is coming in. And by the 3rd of June, it's starting to everyone's thinking, oh my God, what are we going to do? The decision is made, they delay by 24 hours, but it still looks quite marginal. And this is the point at 4:30 in the morning on Monday the 5th, where Eisenhower has to say, yes, we're going to go on the 6th, or we're not, because everyone's got to start moving out sort of like now. And he puts his head in his hands, he sits in that seat, in that chair in the library at Southwark House, puts his head in his hands, thinks about it, looks up and goes, okay, let's go. I think your grandfather was really instrumental in that decision because he was all for it. He was magnificent in that period. The clarity of thought that he brings to a very complex operation. We're committed, we've done it, we need to back ourselves, we've done everything we possibly can.
To find out more about what life was like in the area, I met a pair of childhood friends who grew up in the nearby village. Can you remember the troops arriving?
That was about April when the Americans arrived. I can remember it quite clearly because it was a wet afternoon, and I used to get off the bus, the school bus, at the end of the road, and my mother came to meet me, which was very unusual because I always walked home on my own. She said, it's absolute chaos here. The Americans have arrived. There were several American lorries and a complete catastrophe. The Americans' lorry had collided with a lorry load of pigs and the pigs had escaped. And the American GIs were running here, there and everywhere trying to catch the pigs. Complete chaos.
And that was the first memory?
That was my first memory of the American army arriving here.
You, Pat, had a camp near your farm that was largely British soldiers, was it?
Yes.
And I see.
Yes.
Right. Then there was a lot of Americans based here.
This is the primarily Americans here because of General Eisenhower.
Do you know how many there were around here?
A great many.
It was a lot of people.
Yes.
Felt like a lot of people. You had a barn on the farmyard that was converted, wasn't it?
Yes, it was commandeered by the army. It was used for entertainment, for concerts, film shows, dances, for the American soldiers.
And did you get to go?
We did.
Yes,
Did you go to
we went
those?
to the church service on a Sunday.
And you went to films?
Yes.
Yeah, they were all suitable films, were they?
Well, yes, we were allowed to see them.
Yeah, so brilliant.
We were the only ones there.
Oh, yes. I mean,
Really, the only children there?
Well,
Yes,
yeah, the only children.
yes. The American soldiers used to give me their comics. I used to go to school and talk about people like Superman and Donald Duck and things like that. Superman was my favourite, I think. Really? And of course the other English children had no idea what I was talking about.
No. Pat, this is your photograph album.
Yes.
And I'm looking in particular at a photograph with two soldiers standing either side of two girls who are sitting on the fence. And you've both got ponytails. I think Pat's is slightly longer than Mary's ponytail.
Pat was slightly tidier than me, I think.
Possibly.
I was the scruffy one.
So who was taking these photographs?
One of the American soldiers, I guess.
There's one here with two girls, you two.
Yes.
You've covered yourself in hay.
We'd made a little heap of hay and we were
yes.
playing in the hay.
Yeah, you were playing in the hay. And then behind are three soldiers.
So the one in the middle, I think, is Mr. Hillier.
Yeah, he was the one we were particularly friendly
Yes.
with.
D-Day itself, which was the 6th of June, you were at
Yes.
school. So was there a talk about it on the next day, do you think, at school? Can you remember?
I was walking down the lane here. There was another sort of drive down to Southwark House.
Yeah.
And I could see in the distance, and there were a couple of enormous staff cars and driving at huge speed, and they were going so fast that you could see the dust coming up. And I thought, this is odd. There's something strange. It was, And then about halfway through the morning, when we were in class, the head teacher came in and she said, "You're all going to remember this day. It's D-Day."
Before D-Day, all the soldiers and the vehicles were parked around the house, in the paddock and in the fields. And in the evening, they had their meal. And I watched from my bedroom window. Then I got into bed and went to sleep. When I got up in the morning, they were all gone.
Really?
They were completely cleared. And that was D-Day.
I took the ferry to Normandy, where I wanted to understand how people remember those that never came home after D-Day and the Normandy campaign. On the 5th of June, the day before D-Day, as the men were embarking on their landing craft, or the ships that were going to take them across the channel, they received a message from Grandfather, and it read, "The time has come to deal the enemy a terrific blow in Western Europe. The blow will be struck by the combined sea, land and air forces of the Allies, together constituting one great Allied team under the supreme command of General Eisenhower. On the eve of this great adventure, I send my best wishes to every soldier in the Allied team. To us is given the honour of striking a blow for freedom which will live in history. And in the better days that lie ahead, men will speak with pride of our doings. We have a great and righteous cause." My journey in Monty's footsteps is raising funds for the educational programme of the British Normandy Memorial, situated above one of the D-Day beaches, Gold Beach. Inscribed on the columns of the memorial are the names of the over 22,000 men and women under British command who died in the Normandy campaign. It's been a privilege to me, probably the greatest privilege of my life, to meet veterans and go back to the memorial and watch veterans standing silently, looking out to sea, lost in their memories. I have learnt so much. I've heard stories of sacrifice and courage that are hard to comprehend.
That's Dennis Circle, a lovely guy. And he was in the signal section of the 2nd Fourth Essex, and he was one of us 200 who were transferred to the Dorsets, and he became a rifleman. And he died on Hill 112.
He was one of the men who you would say was a man and you were a boy.
Oh yes, he was a territorial before the war, like my brother was. He was 22 to my 18. So Dennis would be about the same time. They were distinctly men, they talked marriage and that sort of thing. Yeah. Whereas we had girlfriends and things. We were youngsters.
So he was like your mentor, really, wasn't he?
In signals work, all the other guys were nice, but he came to me several times and said, "If there's anything you don't understand, anything that's beyond you, just come and ask. I think I can help you." Because I was a young signaller, I'd just learned it, and he'd been at it for years. And he met a girl from the Middlesbrough phone exchange over the telephone at night, arranged to go in and meet her, and did. Absolutely fell for each other, and he had the photograph. She was wearing a hat, I remember, in the picture. She was dressed for a party or going to church or something. Distinctly wanted to get married, but he said no, not till after the war. They never did.
He died, Ken, on
Hill 112.
On the 10th of July.
Yeah, 2 days after I was captured.
So
when my brother was wounded, either that day or the next day.
So you didn't discover until after the war that he'd been killed?
Long after the war. Yeah. I don't really remember how I learnt.
No.
But, and there probably are others here, but I don't know. You see, we moved over from the Essex, so we didn't know many Dorsets.
No.
Living where I am in Normandy, obviously I've met a lot of Normandy veterans, one of whom, Reginald Pye, is a dear friend. What you find as they get towards their twilight years, there's a lot of reflection, and there are things they need to do. Part of the things they need to do is to commemorate their comrades, to never forget. He was a Royal Engineer.
Yeah.
224 Field Company, and he wanted to meet a girl that he met and gave food to in a place called Vérigny. After the Battle of Falaise, he got his first rations when he was literally about to tuck into a jam sandwich. He saw this young girl, 14 years old. Her name was Huguette, and she looked starving. He tried to give her sardines, and she's like, no. So he gave her a jam sandwich, and which was no small thing. He hadn't eaten for days. The next morning when he woke up by his lorry, she'd left a mess tin full of milk, a photograph, her name, her age, and he looked for her for 78 years, and finally she was found, and I had the joy of taking him back to meet her, and that was so beautiful. Second thing was something that the British Normandy Memorial really helped us with, was to commemorate a friend that had died during the war when they exchanged places. So now there is a plaque here with his name, with Reginald Pye's name. Yes. Yeah, so Wally Stanion. And then the final thing was to find his friend's grave and put a wreath there for him. And that was in Kiel. Other veterans who've wanted to come back and just to see the memorial, like Harry Howarth, he was one of the first to land on Sword Beach. Yeah. And at the ripe old age of 102, he wanted to get back here and see the memorial to try and find some names. Yeah. When I took him back to Sword Beach for the first time in 80 years, the look on his face was, and also his face when he came here, the emotion. Fulfilling these wishes, it's paying it forward. You know, I'm free, I'm able to sit here talking to you today because of the sacrifices. I find it incredibly moving, and it is tough sometimes, but so necessary.
Paul, you are the grandson of George Hanks.
That's right, Private George Hanks.
Tell me a bit about your journey in discovering your grandfather's story.
Well, about 11 years ago, my mother gave me a box of love letters that were written by my grandfather George from when he was here in Normandy in 1944. My mother was only a year old when George was killed, so she could never read them. And she handed them to me, and I started researching George's travels, researching through Imperial War Museum, military records and regiment records, which led me to Normandy, to eventually where he was killed in a tiny commune called Etry, which is about 40 miles south of the memorial.
And that's how you met Michel?
Yes,
or
Michel's father, Albert.
Yeah.
So in April 2016, there was a reception ceremony at Etry, and they very kindly adopted my grandfather as their own soldier. While we were there, we met Albert. And it transpires that my grandfather was killed on Albert's farm. And when Albert was just 12 years old, Nazi SS soldiers put a gun to his head, demand milk and butter. To help him cope with the trauma, his mother made him look after my grandfather's grave. So for 3 years he would tend it, put flowers on there, until the body was eventually moved to the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery at St Charles de Percy.
Our father never told us about this story. He was a person who was really discreet.
Very modest.
Very modest.
Yes. Yeah.
He was only 12 years old, and he kept a very bad memory of this part of his life.
Yes.
And he didn't really told us about this story, but we tried to stay, we keep in touch to keep the memory of his grandfather and my father.
When you first met Albert, what was his reaction?
He was a bit nervous about coming forward and telling us the story in case it upset us. He took us to the spot where my grandfather was killed and was buried. We drove down this track and he was stood there to attention, and he was very smartly dressed with all his medals on, and clearly it meant something to him. Through meeting him, though, it gave closure to my mother, because she'd always felt the body should have been repatriated, which of course would never happen. But through meeting Albert, we knew that George had been looked after, and it gave Mum closure that he was at rest with his mates being looked after.
Michel, When you arrived here today with Paul, did Paul take you to see George Hanks's name on one of the columns?
I think it's a very good memory, it's the best place. We need to have this memory for all the young people, and it made us connected.
Yes.
Yeah. I personally feel it's incredibly important that we continue to keep the stories alive and that we learn from those stories and commit ourselves to ensuring that we earn the freedoms that were won for us.
The thing which is so fascinating about the Second World War is the way you can zoom in or zoom out, and either perspective is fascinating, and yet they both sort of have to go together, by which I mean there's nothing as inspiring often as hearing about individual tales of heroism, not always heroism, sometimes just sheer adversity suffered by the servicemen and women, but then also to remember that while they are struggling up cliffs and across sand dunes and through the bocage of Normandy, it's not just their story, but something wider that is being fought for, and that it is our duty to ensure that what they fought for, and many of them died for, remains.
Is remembering what happened a sort of something that you consciously do in thinking about the Second World War?
Remembering Sunday within this stadium, 2 minutes, everybody stops.
Yeah.
So that still happens today. So it's still, even all these years afterwards, and within a very different environment, as you would say, you think in terms of a football stadium, it's still, certainly very much instilled in everybody that it is important to learn and to remember what happened to a whole generation of people who were caught up in the most tragic of circumstances. I think in more recent, last 10, 20 years, looking at the First and Second World War has been an important aspect now of research. And so that's now a big aspect of a lot of the work that's going on with the football historians with the various clubs in Scotland, and it'll be the same in England and elsewhere as well. So it's a recognition that football did continue, that it had a role to play, and it's very much tied in with the Greater War effort. So there should be a reflection in the clubs and their history to look at what was happening and the contributions that were made.
There is a lot of trouble in the world at the moment. We have to remember back to events of 1944 and how we got there, and the sacrifices that were made by people on all sides for freedom and the liberty we've enjoyed for many, many years. And let's hope we never have to go through it again.
It was my life. You just lived it. You didn't sort of think about it. I think that it's very important that young people today are aware of what went on and the sacrifices that people made and what they put up with and all the rest of it. So I think it is very important that we do remember as much as we can about it.
It's a global conflict, the like of which no one in the world had seen before, with terrible consequences. And the generations that came back who lived through it understood the value of peace and understood the sacrifices that have been made to allow us to have enjoyed the 80 years of peace we have in this country and elsewhere in the Western Hemisphere. And we forget that at our peril. The trouble with such an enormous conflict like the Second World War slipping out of living memory is we forget the cost of it.
Yes.
And we start to take that peace for granted, and we start to become complacent and entitled. By remembering that sacrifice, that should help us to remember the cost of conflict and how hard won the enjoyments we still enjoy to this day were achieved.
Because you've dedicated your life to not necessarily always telling your story, but actually going into schools and talking about what your experience is. How important?
That's come later.
Has it?
Yes.
And what was the drive for that?
I used to attend once a month at Whalley Chapel. There was a military service. One of the girls there who was a clerk in the office, and she was something to do with school. And she said to me one time, "Would you come and talk to our pupils?" So I said, "What about, dear?" "About the war and what you did and what you..." "I'm no hero." No, just come and tell your story." I went up to Tiptree and spoke to them. They were tickled pink.
That sowed a seed in you.
But that started it. Yeah. I go in now, and all the children are sitting 120, anything between 90 and 120, sitting on the floor. They all jump up, "Hello, Grandad Ken." And that stems from the first time they came. They said, "Is there a fee?" So I said, "No, I'm not a professional speaker." Yes, there is a fee. I want the children to write me a letter. Well, you tell them. So at the end of my talk, I said, "Now, you've got to do some work. Your next English lesson, I want you each to write to me and tell me what you didn't like about my talk, what you did like, and what you want to be when you grow up, whatever you become. Yes. If there's anything you can do, any contribution you can make to keep peace, yes, you do it. Yes. It's the most important thing in your life, you keep peace."
I am actually encouraged that all the people I've spoken to, there's a great desire to keep the stories alive and to learn from those stories. Talking to some of the teachers, I'm supremely confident that younger generations will have the opportunity to learn and to reflect on the sacrifice. I think that there is plenty of hope.